Alrighty, good day and aloha students. Here we are today. Modern world history class continues. Today this topic is the Great Depression. One of the most influential moments, time periods, decades, just over 1 decade long, almost 2 decades long. One of the most influential time periods in modern world history. It was a worldwide event and really a precursor to the worst war in world history. Okay, so here we go. When did it occur? We sort of started in 1929 is what we sort of look at as the seminal beginning date. We go through to the early 1940s, and really we sort of say the end of it is 1945, when World War II finally comes to a conclusion. All right, so what does depression mean? Maybe you've heard the term recession. Recession is thrown around a lot in modern times, and it really has to do with economics. So the depression is really economics. Supply, demand, all those things you would learn in economics class. That's really what we're talking about here is an economic issue. An extended slump in business activity. Slump. Where people don't have money to go to a business, maybe they don't have enough money, extra money to go out and go to a restaurant. So what happens to that restaurant's business? All their customers can't come as often, don't come hardly at all, stop coming. What happens to that business? That's the kind of business activity I'm talking about. And there are reasons why this happened. Why do we say 1929? I think some of you know this. There was a time period in late 1929 where we say that the U.S. stock market crashed. In other words, the value of all, and you understand this a little bit because you've seen my discussion on money talks. The money talk, how you invest in publicly traded companies. You become a part, of course I always use Coca-Cola and AT&T. Remember those money talk discussions where you buy stock in a company, a publicly traded company, and you become a part owner because you own stocks in the company. So you are a part owner, and you hope that the value of that company that you are a part owner in goes up in value. Well, when it crashes, obviously it goes down in value. Now, why did this? What does this mean? This means that, well, technically, if you owned stock in a business in 1929. Really, virtually the vast majority of these publicly traded companies on the stock market went down in value, in many cases significantly. In many cases, these companies ceased to exist. So you have to understand that's part of investing in the stock market, that there's a chance that the company that you buy stock in individually could crash, the entire market could crash, the company's value goes down, and you lose all your money. And in essence, that's exactly what happened on a massive scale. Sometimes we see in modern times individual businesses that sometimes they get bought out before they really officially fail. But in 1929, it was a wide-scale situation. Now, some say that part of the reason is there was too much buying on credit. Now, if you study, if you found the money talks interesting and worthy of listening to and worthy of continued study, one of the things you would learn about is something called margin, buying on margin, and it was really going crazy in the 1920s, buying on margin. What it really means, and look, it still happens today. It's a common practice. It's not illegal. It can get over the top, which some would argue is exactly what happened in 1929. In other words, what basically happens is you want to buy stock in a company. Well, how do you that you really believe is going to go up in value? What's something you can do? Well, borrow some money. Borrow some extra, get a loan to buy some more stock in this particular company or companies. And what really sort of happens is there's a bank run in 1929. And really, you could probably make the argument that the bank run, the stock market falters, all right? Now, but does the stock market really crash 100%? No. The stock market falters, and then what happens is that the people, a couple of people who are now suddenly, okay, now I don't have any money to pay off my margin loan, now I'm in big trouble. All right, and what happens is a panic occurs, and people who loaned out the money, specifically banks, start to call in people to pay off their loans. Well, where is all that money tied up in? Well, it's tied up in the stock market, which has just faltered. And now people are worried about having any money at all. And so there's a selling, everybody's selling like crazy to create cash to pay off their loans. Meanwhile, the value of companies is dropping, so the sell price is going down. So people are not making as much on their sales. The banks, and I think you understand this about banks, banks don't have all the people that have accounts in a bank, all that money is not sitting in the safe inside of an individual bank. Just a small percentage is, as banks loan out money. But people come and they call in these loans. And then regular folks that don't have all that money, they go to the bank and demand their cash be withdrawn. They want all their cash back, but of course the bank doesn't have it. And you have this massive panic that occurs. And really sort of what we come to realize, and look, this point right here, this is an issue that many people fear is happening today. And that is that we have, this is a debt issue, isn't it? There's not enough money really in existence to pay off all of the outstanding margin loans. The margin is called margin calls. We're calling in our margin loans. We're calling in our loans. So in other words, the point is that the buying on credit was so over the top that really not all that money really existed. And again, you could make the argument the same thing is happening today. Is there really the amount of cash in existence out there to really pay off the debts that everybody has? And not just in the stock market, but other aspects as well. So not enough money really existed to pay off those loans in 1929. Okay, so now everybody's sort of stuck and everybody comes to a halt. And so we have bank closures, all right? And many of these, in those times, you didn't have as many of the big banks as we sort of have today. That phenomenon was just sort of really getting rolling. Most banks in these times were local banks, maybe just within a state, maybe within a couple states. Some local banks were even just within individual towns, maybe in a couple towns in a state. They're not even statewide. But a lot of businesses would rely on these local banks for loans to get their materials, to create their products and pay their workers. And then the idea is we sell that product or sell that service, and then we pay back our loan. Well, banks are closed. Banks are not willing to loan out money to businesses. And so now the businesses need to start laying off people. They start laying off their employees. Because we can't really afford to build anything else. We can't afford to create or make anything else. So we're going to stop making it because we haven't sold anything. We don't want to make anything else, so we have to lay off our employees. So these employees go home and suddenly they have no paychecks coming in. Are they going to be buying things? Well, of course not. They're not going to be buying anything. They're going to be reusing their stuff that they already have. They're going to be very careful with any money they have. They're not going to go out to dinner. They're not going to go out to a restaurant. They're not going to go buy new clothes. Okay? And then those restaurants and those clothing makers and those producers of the products of those types of businesses, they're out of luck as well. And so businesses make less money because nobody's buying anything. And you can see that this is a nasty cycle, isn't it? This is a nasty, nasty cycle to get into. And so I'm just sort of talking about the United States, but we must admit that this is a worldwide, the Great Depression goes worldwide. why does it do this? Okay, and this is another controversial aspect that is hotly debated. The use of tariffs, okay, or taxes. All right, a tariff is a tax on an imported good, and this is extremely common in the time of nations. Countries do this all the time to each other. The United States just is not the only one who does this. All nations of the world do this. A lot of what we would, of course, call foreign countries put tariffs on American products that go to their countries. All right, and so when you do this, what is the point? What is the point? You may say, Mr. O'Brien. Okay, well, we have American companies that make product X. Okay, there are foreign countries and companies in those foreign companies who make product X as well, and the foreign companies, they try to sell product X in the United States. Well, what basically happens is the United States government comes in and says, okay, we're going to put a tariff, a tax on the foreign product X. Well, what happens to the price of foreign product X in the United States then? The foreign company's not going to pay that tax. The consumer is. So what happens to the price of product X from the foreign country? It goes up. And so what will Americans do? Well, we'll just buy the American product X. And that was the argument behind it. That is always the argument behind tariffs. I can tell you an example in the 1980s. The United States government saved Harley-Davidson motorcycles, right? You all know what a Harley-Davidson motorcycle is. Well, that company was really saved in the 1980s when the U.S. government came in and put a tariff on mostly what were Japanese motorcycles. So therefore, what happened to the price of Japanese motorcycles in the United States? They went up. And so what did people do? They bought American motorcycles. One of the companies was, of course, Harley-Davidson. So this is a simple example. Now, you may say, okay, what does that mean? Really what it means is all goods prices went up. And part of it is there are sometimes tariffs cause prices to go up because the tax is passed on to the consumer, the person who buys the product. All right, so again, if prices go up, here you're trying to solve this thing to make American products the choice. But in some cases, an American product has a foreign part, doesn't it? So if you have a foreign part that you need, that no American company makes, you have a foreign part that fits into this thing, your American product, you still are, the American product is going to go up in cost, up in price because of that foreign part. And so now if prices are always going to go up, and dare I say worldwide, more things are going to go unsold. One of the most famous one of these is the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act in the United States, and this was a tax that originally happened in the administration of President Hoover, the president before Roosevelt. I think you're all aware of Franklin Roosevelt and his role at this time, being the president during the Great Depression and the Second World War. The Great Depression is really sort of rolling before Roosevelt takes office. And one of these things that Hoover did was a tariff act. And this is not necessarily, this is an attempt to, this is the most famous attempt to raise tariffs to protect American products. Now, something happened in the United States that is an important part of this story, and that is, so Roosevelt is now in office by 1934, but this makes the Great Depression sort of worse in the United States, and that was the 1934 Dust Bowl. There's a famous book from this time period by a guy named John Steinbeck called The Grapes of Wrath. And The Grapes of Wrath was about a family from Oklahoma, a family of farmers, who basically loses everything because their farm is swallowed up by the Dust Bowl. Now, what the heck is that, Mr. O'Brien? All right, well, the Dust Bowl literally was a drought. Literally what it was a drought. I think that's the best way to sort of describe it. And these bad weather conditions combined with overproduction for the really sort of a decade and a half really sort of left the fields infertile. Now, I think you may know this as well, that a farmer has a particular amount of land. A farmer will always leave at least one section of his land unplanted every year. At least. Some people call this the soil bank. Now, what does this mean? This means that you may say, well, why wouldn't a farmer plant every inch of his land? Well, because what does soil need to do? Soil needs to replenish itself. And the earth and soil can do that. It can replenish itself. But it needs to be left alone for a certain amount of time. Well, what happened was once World War I got going, American farmers started to basically plant all of their land. Because not only were they feeding Americans during World War I, they were feeding their allies as well. Okay, and if you do that too much, you take all the nutrients out of the soil, and the soil gets thinned. It almost gets sand-like. And there are when that happens, the plants within it die. The grasses, to a degree, the trees and the shrubs that hold soil down, those things die because the soil is so loose, it's so thin, it has no substance to it. And so then, this is why it's called a dust bowl, because a wind comes along, and what happens to that fine sand-like soil now? It gets picked up by the winds. And so you would have these literally dust storms that would block out the sun. Anything that had the ability to be planted would get destroyed. Anything that would get buried. People's homes would just be full of dust. It was just awful. And so the Grapes of Wrath is a story about a family who picks up from Oklahoma. They've lost everything in the Dust Bowl, and they moved to California to be part of the Grapes of Wrath. They moved there, I believe, if my memory serves. It's been a long time since I've reviewed the book. They go to the great wine valleys of California to try to make a life for themselves. One of the most famous books of all time, called The Grapes of Wrath. Okay, so what's the importance of the Great Depression? Well, I would say that people wanted answers, and people wanted solutions, and populations all over the world were dealing with this. And we sort of discussed this when we discussed the Germans in between the wars at the beginning of the semester here. So nations were looking to people who could fix things, and sometimes some of these leaders promised quick fixes, and Hitler was one of those guys. He promised to get everybody to work and promised people jobs, and a lot of times that was in rebuilding their military, but by God, he did it. And Mussolini in Italy was the same way, making promises to get our society going in the get out of the Great Depression, quick economic fixes. Some nations became aggressive towards their neighbors. They became aggressive, and what I mean by this is they were willing to invade other places to get natural resources, to be brought back to the home country, to solve the problem. And I think one of the best examples of this is Japan's invasion of China. Is probably maybe the best example of all. The Italians attacked in Africa. Remember the story of Bibi Bikila from Ethiopia. One of the reasons why that was such a big deal was Italy had invaded Ethiopia in the 1930s, and of course Germany's European invasions. The invasion of the Soviet Union was to get the oil. Part of that was to get the oil fields in the southern part, the southwestern part of the Soviet Union. So some nations were willing to do that. Some nations were, and really I would sort of argue this is the same of all these others, but some governments, Some nations' governments exploded in size with guarantees of aid and help, and our government's going to take care of every single individual who needs it. And really, we're going to see this with the U.S. social programs of the 1930s when we talk about FDR at the beginning of next week, one of the next WIDP that we will do next week. Okay, so one of the things I would like you to look up, you can take a look at these, and really what they are is homeless encampments during this time period. So I want you to look up Hoovervilles. They're one of the most famous things that sort of came out of this, and we see these throughout the 1930s in the United States, and they were named after President Hoover, but you can take a look at some of those. There are some sad, certainly some sad pictures, sad shots of Hoovervilles, but they are something I think you would find sort of interesting. And really, Hoover and Roosevelt sort of followed similar paths. Hoover picked on some extreme big government policies, many of which Roosevelt, to be honest with you, Roosevelt kept, even though Roosevelt expanded it thoroughly. One of the great debates in modern times is, did Roosevelt make the Great Depression, did he help get over the Great Depression, or did he hinder the ability that the U.S. had to get out of the Great Depression and really extended the Did Roosevelt extend the Great Depression, or did he solve the Great Depression? That's one of the great debates about Roosevelt, one of the, I think, two most significant presidents of American history in the 20th century. Okay, everybody, so there's your discussion on the Great Depression. Make sure you look up Hoovervilles. I think you'll find that very fascinating. Okay? All right, see you next time.